marriage for many women really meant security. So although obviously many women married for love, the hope of getting some financial security must, I think, have played a role in many decisions when it came to marriage.
Hello, I'm Natalie from Genealogy Stories, and welcome to Twice Removed, the show where we talk about everything history related. Hi, so today I'm joined by Judith Batchelor, better known as Genealogy Jude. Jude is a avid genealogist and a fantastic blogger, and I can't wait to get started today. Hi Jude, how are you?
Hi Natalie, very well, thank you.
I was wondering, I always start with this question. Could you tell me a little bit about what got you started? Why did you start tracing your family tree?
Well, I think really right from the word go, from my sort of earliest memories, I always have loved history. And for me, family history was just a way of making history more personal.
Yeah.
And putting your own ancestors in the context of the sort of, the wider world that you were learning at school. And also, I think because I'm the youngest in my family, I had a lot of more elderly relatives and cousins. So I always wanted to know about the past and ask the questions. And when I was probably 13 years old, something like that, my big brother, who's nearly 20 years older than me, I collared him and we went up to St. Catherine's house in that day and found the entry of the birth of my great-grandfather. And we also took a trip to the local churchyard and started hunting for ancestors' graves, and it really went from there.
Oh, that's a lovely memory to have with a sibling, and obviously you started really young then.
Yeah.
There's a really good there's a really nice community of really young genealogists on Twitter, going by the Hidden Branch is their group name, and it's really lovely to see young people picking it up and running with it, because otherwise we'll all die out.
Yeah, indeed. And I think things have changed a little bit in that certainly when I was a teenager, it was actually quite difficult to do research because you could only go to the archives during the week, and online research didn't exist at all. So I think it's really great that young people have more opportunity to start. You don't have to wait till you're retired and got loads of time on your hands. You can get stuck in right now.
Yeah, which is great, because there really is never enough time to trace your family tree, is there? It just goes on and on and on and on.
You've got to start early, because otherwise, you'll never get anywhere close to feeling discovered, many generations.
So how did your older relatives feel about you starting to trace the family tree? Were they quite encouraging? Did they share any stories with you?
A little bit, yeah. But like my dad would say to me, why do you want to go, digging up those people? Let them rest, So I can't say anybody else really shared my enthusiasm, with the possible exception of this one brother who, took me under his wing a little bit.
Okay.
And also some of my relatives were quite old. So like I had only one grandparent that I knew personally. And, she died when she was 90. So although I really enjoyed talking with her, it was there wasn't that much she could remember some of the details. But I used to ask questions like, who was your best friend, Grandma?
I really like those questions, though, because those are questions that I wish that I had asked my ancestors, or my great grandparents when they were alive. You just don't think of them at the time. But yeah, and I quite often look at marriage certificates and look at the witnesses and think, oh, was that their friend? Or, I wish I knew.
When some years later, when I got a marriage certificate, I looked at the witness's name and it was Violet Doughty, and that rang a bell, and I thought, oh yes, that was Grandma's best friend.
Oh, that's lovely.
Quite nice when you tie up a sort of family story with sort of documentary evidence as well.
Absolutely. I remember reading on your blog about you hearing a story about an ancestor that had one arm. Or lost an arm, and I just wondered whether you could tell me a bit about that. It sounds like a really intriguing story, and I did read the post, but it was quite a long time ago, so I was wondering whether you could tell us about it.
Yes, well, that story came from the same, one grandparent who I knew very well. And I asked her, what can you tell me about the family? And she mentioned that there was a relative that had lost their arm. And that sort of story stayed with me ever since, unsurprisingly. So it's always sort of been there in the background and niggled at me. And through researching the family, I reckoned that it was one of her family members who worked on the railways, because
Okay.
that sort of, would match with how someone could lose an arm. But I never had the complete evidence. And then last year, I got a photograph of her grandfather, and it looked very suspicious that he could be missing an arm, just the way the fold of his suit was draped. And I'd already got his railway employment records. And that was quite fascinating, because in March 1888, there was an entry to say that he was ill. And whereas he was working as a foreman porter at a station, he didn't go back to work until August. And then he became a gateman in Weston-super-Mare, which was rather a demotion and a role that would typically be undertaken by an elderly person or somebody who was disabled. So that was a huge clue, because it gave me a time period when this alleged accident could have happened. But again, didn't have the proof. But one day, as you do, you sort of keep picking it up, keep prodding, keep trying to see whether you can find something. Looking specifically in newspaper records on the British Newspaper Archive, I checked for March 1888 and the local newspaper, and it turned out that there was an entry regarding his accident and how it happened, but it had been indexed very badly and wasn't possible to find just with usual search terms. But it told me what had happened, and basically he'd been in a carriage on a train sorting out some stuff, and then another train had bumped into it and thrown him out onto the tracks, and then the train had rolled back over his arm.
Oh.
Been rushed to the local hospital in Dorchester, and they tried to save his arm and failed and had to amputate it.
But managed to save his life, which is quite remarkable, really.
Yeah, and it was interesting, because I found a lot of other stories in the newspaper, especially when he was a gateman down in Weston-super-Mare, where there had been some accidents, and it made me realise that he obviously had gone through this terrible traumatic experience through his work on the railway, and then it was his job to also try and prevent accidents for others in his role as a gateman. He'd be in charge of the level crossing and making sure that the gates were closed when the train was coming, and warning people if a train was approaching. So
that's quite ties up quite nicely, really, doesn't it? It's kind of a nice symmetry to it.
Realize there are a lot of sort of ordinary heroes. He was doing his job. In the records, he's described as a railway policeman.
Okay.
Which at first sort of thought, is this a separate role? But actually, I think it was just because he was the gateman, so he was policing the crossing.
I see. Right. Okay. Oh, that's really interesting.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's funny what you say about heroes, because I think we tend to think of war heroes when we say that word, or nurses and that kind of thing, and sometimes forget that actually very ordinary people do small things in their lives that can be quite heroic, like just doing their job every day. Which is kind of relevant to today, really, with all the people still working in supermarkets and doing their bit. So so is he one of your favorite ancestors, or have you got any real favorites that you keep coming back to?
I suppose to some extent. I don't know whether you would feel the same here, but the more you know about somebody, the more you feel closer to them.
Yeah.
So I would say that some of my sort of Victorian ancestors, who I actually know quite a lot about, become favourites. I think the challenge is sometimes where you go further back and there's less sources that mention them. It's trying to really discover who they were and get beyond just the name in the records. I think from, you know, Victorian times onwards, there's just a big range. You know, you can find them in many censuses, you can find them in newspapers, you can piece together their stories quite well.
Yeah, and I think the newspapers makes a phenomenal difference. If you find your ancestor in a newspaper, you know, it gives you a really, you know, such a fantastic insight into their lives. And yeah, I agree. You feel like you've really got to know them, and that can be a lot harder when you go further back, just because of, unless they were rich or very, very literate and wrote something down, you know, it can be quite hard. Although, having said that, I have found an ancestor that was accused of being a witch by the local reverend in like the 1700s, and because he was quite eccentric, he documents all their encounters, and you know, he believes that she's the cause of his lame horse and all these various things. And I think she just was a bit ugly and old, unfortunately, from the description, and that was her sole crime, really, was to be a bit of an old crone. Yeah, bless her. So, and I really like her, but yeah, I agree that it is quite difficult to find those details, or it's potluck, a little bit more potluck about finding those kind of details on ancestors for pre-Victorian or pre-1837, really.
I think the secret perhaps is to really educate yourself in the local and the social history, because then you sort of understand, at least, say, you know, I have loads of agricultural labourers, but if you find out, you know, how much they earned a week, you know, what their hours were like, what sort of farming was like, you know, what was the degree of mechanization, and find out all the stories associated with the place they were living, and other people that they would have known. It's the sort of next best thing. Obviously, you'd always love to find a specific reference to your own ancestor, but in lieu of actual, you know, mentions, I think it can really enlighten you and give you an appreciation of their lives.
I absolutely agree, and I think sometimes when we're tracing our family history, it can be quite easy to fall down a rabbit hole where you look at them in isolation rather than looking at them in the context of the time and the place that they lived in. And I think if you don't do that, then one, you're not going to understand them fully, and you're not going to understand their actions. And I think that's where you fall into the traps of kind of judging the past on modern standards. So no, I completely agree. Looking at wider history is a great way of actually getting to know your own small history, your own ancestors. So with that being said, then, do you have a favorite time period? I wonder whether it's going to be the same as mine. So far, I'm doing really well. Most of the interviewers are on my side.
Yeah, well, probably I do like the Victorian period because of the range of sources. Would you say the same for you?
Yeah, and I just think they're so interesting as well. And I've got some guests queued up for the next few talks, and I'm beginning to realise that a lot of them have quite a lot of Victorian focus. But yeah, no, it is definitely my favourite.
And also, even you know, there's the sort of visible evidence around you. You know, you can sort of walk the streets, and I love the books you get on sort of old photographs of a place, and it doesn't take a huge leap of your imagination, you know, whereas perhaps as you go back, that it just becomes a little bit more difficult to you know, put yourself in their shoes.
No, I agree. Do you have many photos? You mentioned you have found a photo with your ancestor where it looked suspiciously like they might have lost an arm. How did you find that photo? Was it one that you already had, or?
Well, I have one surviving aunt, so she had that in an album. I wouldn't say I have a huge amount of photos. I don't think many of my ancestors took a lot of photos. You know, there were probably some which were the special occasion photos, but not a huge amount. And also the fact, I think that like both my parents were sort of younger children, meant that the photos haven't necessarily come down my line. So there's always the hope that some might emerge one day. A couple of years ago, I found a relative in Canada through just sort of Googling names, and found that she'd written about one or two ancestors in common. And she had a couple of photos which I'd never seen before. So I always think there's hope that even if you don't have too many yourself, somebody out there may have more, and they're willing to share. So
yeah, I think that's a definite benefit of tracing your family history, actually, that there is that possibility. I've got quite a few clients that I have ask whether I can help them find photos, and I always say it's luck, but the more cousin bait, for want of a better term, that you put out there, the more likely you are to find a cousin of some sort or distant relation that has something.
yeah.
So we've chatted a little bit about favourite ancestors. Do you have any that you don't like? Or that challenge you, shall we say?
Yeah, the ones that seem to be hiding and I can't find them.
Yeah, yeah.
So I suppose that's not personal to them, but the sort of ancestors that keep you up at night and stop you going to sleep because you keep wondering where they're from, and you keep trying to knock down their brick wall. I've got one particular one who I can't find any. He was born probably about 1838, but I can't find any birth certificate for him.
Mm.
I can't find any baptism for him, and I can't find him in the 1841 census. But he appears with an uncle and aunt in 1851. So I'm sure that, although in fact I do know who his parents are, or at least who he said they were, I'm sure there's a big mystery about his birth. I wonder whether, was he found on a doorstep and adopted, or
or illegitimate, and just
was
yeah,
he an illegitimate child of a
yeah.
unknown relative? So I wouldn't say it's that I dislike him, but I find him very annoying.
Yeah, they're really tantalizing, those kind of things as well, aren't they? And
Yeah.
it always feels like it's just within reach. Yeah. Have you dabbled into DNA yet?
Yes, I had my DNA tested a couple of years ago. I have two cousins also who I have their results, and an aunt. Sadly, not my parents, so that would have been lovely. I come a bit late to that. But I would say that DNA for me is an area where I feel I have so much to learn. I'm not the best scientist, so some of the terminology and just the getting my head around the subject I find quite challenging. So that is a goal for me. I think you can't sort of bury your head in the sand. It's just too good a resource to ignore. But I definitely want to exploit my DNA further. I know the basics. I have used it. I know I can do a lot more with it, but I think it's up to me to really get stuck in and learn all the ins and outs.
I think a lot of people feel like that. I think sometimes the jargon around it can be quite off-putting. I know quite a lot of people who've taken their test and said the same thing. I've taken it and I've looked at it, but I don't really feel as if I've maximized it. So I think that'll be a lot of people's goal in 2021. I think sit down and actually get to grips with using the DNA. But obviously, you've always got to use it in conjunction with the paperwork anyway. So or wherever possible. So yeah.
And luckily, there's some really good experts who you can read their blogs, listen to their webinars, and go to their lectures. So
yeah, absolutely, and luckily quite a lot of stuff's been put on for free as well during the pandemic, which is great. I normally find information about that kind of thing on Twitter. So
know who to ask.
Yeah, no, that would be my top tip. Anyone who's starting to trace their family history, go on Twitter and join in on Ancestry Hour on a Tuesday, and get to meet people, and people share a lot of resources and a lot of knowledge. So it's a great way of learning. So I was going to ask you what started you. So I know you've got a fantastic blog, and I've had a peek read, and I really enjoyed your article, especially the one about your growing up in Marlborough, because that's where I went to school. So that was really interesting. What led you to kind of create the blog and start sharing your stories?
I suppose I've always really enjoyed writing, and I just saw that a blog would be a way to sort of harness my writing skills. Also, you have a lot of research projects in your head, and sometimes you never get round to it. So one advantage for me is that the things I blog about usually are to do with something in my own research. So it really makes me analyze all my notes, get it all together, do the research, and put it together in a sort of digestible form, and share with other people too, and other family members.
No, I completely agree. It's only when I find that it's only when I'm starting to write up something that I then can see the gaps. It's a really good tool for that. How important do you think it is to write up and or not necessarily write up, but to create something from your family history to share it? Is it quite important to you, or is it kind of a side product? Or
I'm quite aware, I suppose, that a lot of people don't find family history that interesting.
Who?
They do exist.
Really?
Yeah. So for me, I think if you can write it up, or at least present it in some form that the average ordinary person on the street can appreciate, I think you're helping to sort of secure it for the future. So I don't think I'm old enough that I'm starting to sort of worry about who will have my research after I'm gone, or anything like that. But I think it's a good idea to be able to present it so that people, whatever their experience or their interests, can at least have some appreciation of their ancestry.
And have you started recording any of your own thoughts, especially during the pandemic, just out of interest?
No, can't say I have. I don't know. I've never been one of these people who, some people religiously keep a journal or a diary, and I suppose recording your thoughts is a sort of similar thing to do, just obviously on a audio basis. So no, I haven't. But whether one also needs some perspective, whether it's something that you may come round to. Certainly, I wrote a blog recently about, it was entitled "What Can Your Ancestors Teach You?" And for me, it was quite interesting looking back at the parallels with life in the past, especially wartime, where rationing and just sort of fear and uncertainty were very prevalent. There's nothing new under the sun, and I find that quite inspiring to look back in the past and see how people coped, and particularly with women as well. I think women, particularly in the past, have had a very hard life. They always had a lot of insecurity if their husband died and suddenly they were left with 10 children and no means of support, or they found themselves pregnant and no father around. And had to scrape by doing laundry, doing some dressmaking. So I think that helps. I think it gives you that sort of knowledge that life goes up and down, that we will get through these difficult times just as they did.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that I kept a diary during the first lockdown, and I haven't really written in it much since at all, but I have reread bits of it, and already I'm quite surprised at some of the things that I was worrying about because they didn't come to fruition. Like worrying about food, that was a really big worry, and that did remind me of the war, because I think it's really hard to keep into perspective that when people were living through events, they didn't know how that event would turn out, because obviously when you read history, you read it 9 times out of 10 knowing what happens, knowing if not what happens for that individual, what happens for the wider nation or for the country. So it's then quite hard to imagine that they obviously didn't know that when they were living through it, and you can kind of lose that perspective. So
and perhaps be more critical as well.
Yeah. Do you have any war ancestors? Do you have ancestors that fought in the war? Or I asked that because my family, you'd assume that everybody fought in the war, but actually my family's quite divided. So on my dad's side, actually there's very few people who fought. They were either a little bit too old or a little bit too young for the First World War, or they were ill in some way. And so actually, although some people fought, there isn't a particularly strong line of military people, for example, whereas on my mum's side, it seems that everybody got hit. Everybody was at the right age to serve in either the First World War or the Second World War, or both. So that might seem a bit of a strange question, but that's why I word it that way.
Yeah, no, I get you. I think, again, because my parents were older, both of them lived through the war as children.
Okay.
So my mum was evacuated with her sister to family in Wiley in Wiltshire. So I learned quite a lot about what it was like growing up there during the war. My dad, on my father's side, they're all from a farming background. So, he remembers being in a field with a horse and the siren going and the bombers being overhead, because we're in Kent, where, bomb alley, and having to rush in and trying to get, to safety. And the house I grew up in, we had a big cellar. It was a big old farmhouse, which was served as the bomb shelter. And there was like some steps leading out into the garden, to escape. So I was very aware of that. And in particular, my father's older brother, Gordon, he was in the RAF. He volunteered, and he sadly died as a prisoner of war in 1942, and he was only 23 years old.
Oh, wow, that is young.
He always captures my imagination. I have his diary that he kept as a prisoner of war. It's like this little pocket book, all in very faded pencil. And one thing I was very pleased to do when my father was still alive was to actually transcribe the entries so that my dad could read it. I don't think he'd ever done that before.
That is an incredible find.
Yeah. And I had his medals framed, and I've been researching his squadron as well and finding out about their activities during the Battle of Britain and afterwards, and see what role he played.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I have an RAF ancestor, so they're not my direct ancestor. They are my so it's my granddad's sister's husband. So it's not a blood relative, but my uncle Den, and who I remember vaguely telling me story. I remember him smoking a pipe and watching the horses on a really, really tiny TV. And in their bathroom, they had those dolls that you put over the toilet roll that had all been crocheted by my aunt. And that's kind of, and I remember my Aunt Doris's laugh, and that's about it. But they're quite nice memories. But I do remember this smell of smoke. But yeah, he was in the RAF, and my granddad who's quite a bit younger than his sister, has quite distinct memories of him coming back with a huge thing of bananas. So they never went short on bananas throughout the war. They always had plenty of bananas, but because of Den. But he actually got awarded the Flying Cross, so that was really interesting to research as well. He was quite heroic. So yeah. So yeah, I share that. That's really exciting when you find an RAF ancestor, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, some people, I suppose, think it's more a sort of male preserve, looking at military records, but I find it all very fascinating.
Yeah, actually, I think we forget that our female. I mean, I certainly know that I've been guilty of forgetting that actually our female ancestors may well have served as well in the Second World War, and if they didn't, they might well have volunteered in lots of different ways in both wars. And not necessarily on the front either. I've got a couple of pillars in the tree that were helping out in a kitchen in London, dishing out food to injured soldiers that had come back. So lots and lots of different ways they could be involved, I think. Have you, talking about female ancestors, which I like talking about female ancestors too, funnily enough, have you got any, female ancestors you're particularly proud of or that you feel particularly close to?
One of my interesting female ancestors, I suppose, is a lady called Caroline Bauer, and she intrigues me because she first came to my attention when I got a marriage certificate, and she was born illegitimately, but it actually gives her mother's name as well as her father's name.
Okay.
So this is back in probably about 1838, I think. So
that's unusual.
In registration. But it transpires she married a man that was nearly 45 years older than her. Huge age gap. So she was, a very young girl, early 20s, and he was in his 60s. So you wonder how, what happened, what was the romance? Was she looking for, the father figure that she never had? And her husband, he was a cordwainer, so he made shoes in the village, and he was also oh, what's the chap in a parish that sort of says the prayers and
A pastor, a clergyman?
no, not the church warden, the I can't remember his role, but anyway, he had a role in the parish.
Yeah.
And inevitably, you know, after sort of 8 children and 12 years or so of marriage, he dies. But she marries again, and she marries the man that lives next door, who's also worked for her former husband. So, and
that's intriguing.
together. And of course, there's a suspicion: was, you know, her second husband? Was he really the father of just the one child, or, you know, did he father some of the younger children, you know, that was supposed to be from the first marriage? And you know, she outlived both husbands in the end. But she seems to have led quite an interesting life.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Now that is really intriguing. It does make you wonder. And you obviously, you know, people do have relationships with people much older than them, but 45 years is an incredible gap. Do you think there might have been some financial decisions around that? Obviously, bearing in mind there would not have been any, you know, well, there would have only been really the workhouse as an alternative if you were short on money, or a little bit of maybe outdoor parish relief. Do you think, you know, because obviously being called by now, having a profession.
Yeah, I think on her marriage certificate she was a servant, which was, you know, quite typical. And I suppose we forget that marriage for many women really meant security. So although obviously many women married for love, the hope of getting some financial security must, I think, have played a role in many decisions when it came to marriage.
Yeah, and I should think it would have made it, I should think you could form a type of love for somebody because they gave you that security, if you sort of mean. That might be not quite the same as the love that we might think of when we first meet our partners, if we're, you know, young, free and single nowadays, but actually I should imagine somebody who can give you that security and food on the table and make sure your children are dressed and clothed and that you're going to be looked after in your old age is attractive.
Yes, may not even go as far as sort of trying to climb up the social scale, but yeah, just that sort of board and roof over your head.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just the sheer, like, you know, the real basic practicalities in life, really. Yeah, especially because work opportunities for women were not exactly great, were they, in the 1830s? I mean, you're talking about servants, laundresses if you were working class. I mean, if you were from a more middling class, you might get sort of governess work or teaching work, I suppose. But you know, you had to be literate yourself, which you probably wouldn't have been for the vast majority of the population in 1830s. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have are most of your ancestors from poorer backgrounds, or?
Yes, I would say that practically all my ancestors are fairly working class, sort of, how should I say, respectable working class. I don't think you know, they were on poor relief, or, you know, and in some ways that can make them more difficult to trace, because you don't tend to find a huge amount of, say, probate records for them. Neither were they necessarily getting into trouble or appealing for help from the parish.
Yeah, so more skilled labourers than general labourers, for example.
Yeah, and certainly on my mum's side, a lot of railwaymen. They all seem to have decided when the railways came along that being on the railway was a much more glamorous lifestyle. You know, let's leave behind, you know, going behind a horse in the cold and wet, you know, day after day, manual labour on the farm, and, you know, go for these new fangled machines where they could, you know, ride the train. And
it must have been really exciting though, mustn't it, to see those railways being built and to see the buzz around them and the jobs coming up, to the opportunities coming to be able to work in that environment and to potentially carve out a career, and you wouldn't have known, you know, what that was going to be like. I mean, it must have been exciting and scary.
You know, a chance for career progression as well. You know, certainly one of my ancestors, he, you know, started off as a porter but then becomes a station master. Even if it's, you know, a fairly quiet country station, you had that position of responsibility.
Yeah.
And just the way the railways sort of opened up the country and allowed people to travel and get from one place to the other and go on holiday, even, you know, go to the seaside, see the sights. I think you can forget how novel that must have been, where, you know, if you were poor, you really couldn't get that far without a lot of effort.
Yeah. In fact, I'm quite often surprised by just how mobile my ancestors were before transport, before railways, and certainly after they, you know, that that ability to travel certainly comes into play into terms of where they live and where they crop up in the census.
They all had Fitbits, they'd be recording huge distances, wouldn't they?
Yeah, but then they used to walk huge distances, didn't they? I mean, you think, yeah, you know, I'll just do a 10-mile walk to pop over and see my neighbour, you know, in rural communities. You think, wow, because I live in Somerset in the countryside, and I quite often walk through fields and end up covered in mud. And I quite often imagine what that would have been like if I'd have had big heavy skirts on and had been, you know, trudging to the nearest village to buy a loaf of bread, for example, because the baker here had run out, or need to get some eggs, or
When were Wellingtons invented?
Yeah, most of my ancestors were poor, but a lot of my ancestors were more on that side of unskilled labourers. So luckily for me, less luckily for them, I do get quite a lot of them crop up in the workhouse and things like that. So that does, in terms of traceability, that helps. So although sometimes it can be quite sad and quite tragic to read about their lives, but yeah, it's got its perks for me.
Yeah.
So obviously, I know things have been difficult for people during the pandemic, you know, perhaps in terms of tracing their family history and getting to the archives and such. But what would you say to somebody who is, I always end on this question because I always think it's, people come up with insights that I've never even thought of, although sometimes it throws people at first. So don't worry if you need a sec to think. But I was wondering, what would you say to somebody who was considering tracing their family tree and was perhaps sat on the fence about it?
Oh, I suppose I would hope that my enthusiasm for family history, I could, you know, talk to them, and a bit of it at least would rub off.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the old advice is to talk to your family, and especially the older generation. And I think you can't get away from that. There are certain things that you would never find out within records. So, you know, do the you know, make the effort of writing that letter, making that phone call, tracing that sort of distant cousin who no one has been in touch with for many years.
Yeah, and in some ways now it's a fantastic time to do that because of people having to get to grips with technology like Zoom, and that giving you the ability to record as well, so you can, you know, obviously with their permission, record, not encouraging people to nefariously record their conversations with their family members.
And as we were saying earlier about photographs, you know, you never know, they may not be very interested, but oh, we do have this, you know, I've got an old photo album, do you want it? Or, you know, there's so many ways that you can benefit. And also I think family history has a lovely way of bringing people together. You've got something, you know, to talk about, something that you have in common. So I think it's great for, you know, maintaining sort of social relations within the sort of extended family too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Jude. I'll leave it there. I think that's a lovely place to end, actually, that, you know, trace your family history, because it does bring you connections, if not with your family, it potentially with other people tracing their family history as well. So thank you ever so much for your time. I will make sure that the recording has your website linked to it, so everybody can go and check out your fantastic blog, which I have really enjoyed reading during the pandemic. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie. That's very kind of you. I really enjoyed our chat too.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe or visit me at www.genealogystories.co.uk.